Hi, class. All right, so on a snow day, I thought it would be helpful through this medium to lay out how our discussion on housing and the way housing has become a political issue in Canada can quickly become your third talking points memo for your mock parties in the election campaign we're doing, that you're going to have your annual general meeting soon to draft your last policy on housing. Okay? So not just how our last chat can go into it, but also how some basic questions that will help you in a future independent study unit where you make your own law. In Canada, it's called a private member's bill. How these, some questions that would help that can also get you through this pretty quickly. Okay, so as we've had before, let's show up. There's leading with motive. We want to accomplish blank by implementing a policy of blank. Okay, we had in our chat the four ideas, roughly speaking: build more houses, the simplest, most open way that can be our bridge to the other way of analyzing any proposal that can help this and help your future project. There was make life more affordable with a change to the system of money, monetary policy. We learned about fiat currency, commodity or mineral-based currency, asset currency. Okay, that was the most advanced one we all saw. Okay, and then after that there was the Singapore model, and there was the two versions of rent to own that would require reforms to how rent to own happens in Canada. So let's say, even with what we did in that conversation, you guys look at those four, you pick one. Let's say it's the Singapore model. Okay, you could say the Singapore model of government-built homes being gradually bought by working people. Okay, that's sort of it could be with a down payment, or it could be the public version of rent to own that we talked about. You put that up here. Okay, your top reasons could be why we need more housing, or why property is a good thing, if that's where your party's going. Okay, that's there. And we had the benefits that were in the T-chart for each concept we reviewed. Then when it comes to if pressed on, sure, there's the 2 points on the left-hand side of each T-chart. That could be two of your if pressed on points. But remember, other if pressed on points or other cons, other potential drawbacks to all the other things we talked about could easily apply to what you're saying, because what they all have in common is increasing the supply of housing. Okay, so even if the Singapore model, we didn't talk about gentrification, the concept of gentrification, where aspiring newly wealthy or newly successful middle to upper middle class people moving to a neighborhood to buy new properties can sometimes cause rent and groceries and other things in the area to become expensive, making it harder for average people who are renting beforehand to stay in that area. That concept of gentrification, if it's not on your initial policy that we had a T-chart for, it still probably applies, and you can make that your third point. Okay, so first big thing is that drawbacks from other housing policies might apply to what you guys come up with, whether it's strictly one model from our conversation, or whether you're going for your own unique creative way of building more housing. Okay, so that's one key thing, is that drawbacks for any of those could be applied to yours, and thinking of how you would address that, how your policy could solve it, or evidence that the drawback is not that big of a deal, or doesn't, or in fact the opposite might actually happen when people in other countries have done your idea. That's in your talking points that reply to that opposed point that you get pressed on. Okay, so that's the first key thing, is drawbacks from other policies we discussed could apply to whatever your party determines. And that helps you finish out the assignment, but also be ready. If you care about this issue and you ever actually go out into the real world and campaign for anyone, or even just an advocacy group on a particular model for expanding housing in Canada, you'll be ready for any possible point that opponents bring up, or even just legitimate concerns about trade-offs with what you're proposing. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is that you could, if you weren't getting as much out of our conversation as half the class or however many students who were engaged in that conversation got out of it, and you're thinking, okay, I took the notes, and some things here make sense, other things I'm not so sure. Obviously, talk to your peers, talk to the teacher. If something doesn't make sense, we can clarify that. But if you're looking for a simpler approach to the housing issue, there's the 3 questions. Don't really depend upon where you sit on the political spectrum. These 3 questions are helpful for anyone from any background with any proposal. Okay, so really simple way to go through the last talking points memo, and it will help you when you do your private members bill later on, is you have your idea, whatever the idea may be, and then you have the 3 questions as the if pressed on, because people will inevitably, like a bunch of their concerns, will kind of be saying one of these 3 things with different words. So one is, compared to what? Okay, so that's where you kind of say, what exactly about the status quo, what's currently happening in Canada, what's unacceptable about that? Can you see anyone saying, maybe what you're saying is broken is actually not broken, and it's a fine system? How would you explain what's actually wrong with the current system? But also, to be positive for your own proposal, has anyone done what you're proposing in other countries? That's a great thing about the Singapore model. You can say, yeah, in Singapore they did it, and good things happened. Okay, when it comes to rent control policies, there's been successes, there's been failures on rent control, but you can point to places, arguably parts of Toronto and New York City, it's a big debate, but arguably parts of Toronto and New York City have been benefited greatly by rent control policies. You'd say, well, compared to places where it's happened, my idea has worked, and compared to right now, things aren't going so great. That's like compared to what can drive part of this as well as part of your private members bill. Second question, at what cost? Okay, especially for something like housing. Sometimes, if you're talking about matters of law, it would be cause and effect for what you're promoting or discouraging or tolerating or prohibiting, as we talked about on that sort of spectrum. But if it's a matter of material goods that will cost money, it's very straightforward. If you're asking the government to do something, are you going to raise taxes? Are you going to cut spending to some other activity? And you think it will be worth the trade-off? You know, people who get mad that you cut spending on something else will be like, oh, well, you put the money into something super helpful. Will they say that? And aside from raising taxes or cutting spending elsewhere, could you repurpose any current part of government spending, any current workforce in the government, any current activity in the government? Could it be repurposed for what you're talking about? Okay, so at what cost? With housing, there's repurposing abandoned buildings or former factories, former schools, former churches, buildings that are no longer used for housing. That's one example of how you'd say at what cost if you want to not raise taxes. One thing that was floated in Canada during the Depression was expanding the military and then have the military build homes. Now, Canadians didn't like that idea in the Depression. It was kind of rejected, but it's been floating around. That's just one of many examples of ways you could address at what cost for your housing policy. Okay, another one is something that did happen in parts of the States during the Great Depression was a work for welfare approach where, you know, if you're out of a job, you can get a job helping the government build new houses. Okay? That's at what cost? Third question, what hard evidence do you have? So we kind of mentioned it a bit for compared to what, at what cost, but hard evidence would be where you go more specific, okay? It is a talking points memo, but if something's advancing to that point, it means you're in a setting where you're not just saying a few quick points, door knocking. You're actually proposing this in Parliament, or you're on a public broadcast show or a podcast, and in the podcast that lots of people listen to, you need way more details. So what hard evidence do you have would be ideally a bit of just like a few strong things for why the current approach, at this point it would be housing, but it could be something different when you do your private members bill. Some hard points for why things are not working right now, just with more specific details, numbers, places, things that are happening, okay? And ideally a whole bunch of evidence for if you do what I want the government to do, good things will happen. Okay, so that's the other thing I wanted to go over on this snow day, is that while we've got our T-charts that we can mix and match from to make our last policy for the election with a talking points memo, if you're not liking that approach of the T-charts we generated or what the 4 options were in our class discussion, if you want to make a totally new option and you need to explain why a totally new option is needed on housing, those are the 3 questions. Compared to what? Why do we need to change this? At what cost? Okay, financially, as well as trade-offs in any community where you build new housing that we talked about. And what hard evidence do you have? Those 3 things can get you through a talking points memo if you're not liking the T-charts we had on the housing issue with the 4 options we laid out. And beyond our conclusion to the mock election, those 3 questions, compared to what, at what cost, what hard evidence do you have, they can help you a lot when we're doing the independent study unit in January, a private members bill. Okay, hope that was helpful. Ask questions if you have questions. We'll talk soon.